In this video, we're going to take a quick look at a few of the JSP standard action tags that we've been examining already. A couple of these we've already seen, the include tag and the forward tag, but we're going to expand on that a little bit. And then we're going to take a look at actually working with our objects through JSP tags for using beans and then setting and getting the properties off of those beans. So what we'll want to do is go ahead and get the JSP use beans and standard actions war file, which will have all of the code that we've built previously for our models, which are all valid beans. And we'll have a few pages here that we can navigate through to see some of these tags in action. So let's start by looking at the index. The index, of course, is going to be our basic setup page, but now what we'll note is that we've been able to remove all the scripting by using JSP include tags. So now there's no longer any import tags here, and everything is done directly with standard action JSP include. So nothing really new, just a little more clean as far as the entire system goes now. We have that included through the JSP tag. The next thing to look at is our forward and forward to, which is going to be our destination file. So we'll expand this. So forward is going to have, of course, our JSP forward tag. But what we'll note here is that previously we've simply used JSP forward and we haven't done anything else with it. But now we're going to expand on that just a little to note that we can actually set request parameters right here in the code on our page. All we have to do is include those parameters inside of our JSP forward tag. And so we can forward on to page forward2.jsp with a couple different parameters, one for our password or secret code and one for our user ID. And then once we get to forward to, of course, we can leverage those properties right through the request, getting the parameters just like we've done before, which right now we still will do using scripting. And then we'll just implement that to show those properties here by using a straight old expression and have the user ID and password displayed. Although the password's a password field, so it won't actually display. Let's go ahead and run this in the index here, and we'll see those two things in action, and then we'll take a look at the beans. So here's our include page. Of course, everything is included just like we expected. And here's our forward page, which then forwards on with our two parameters that we passed, and they're displayed on the screen. So for the next part of this video, what I want to do is take the time to look at working with beans on our pages. So we have set beans 2, and use beans that are going to be our main pages. We'll start out on set beans, which is just going to be a plain old JSP page, which essentially is going to allow us to post a username and password, and we'll submit that. Now, we're not doing anything with cookies at this point. That's okay. We're just looking at getting this information. So here's set beans 2. What's important to note is when we get to set beans 2 and we're going to actually start working with a bean on the page, we need to make sure to import any of the code models that we're going to be using. So here we have com.worldmanager.models.star so that we can actually use that code on our page, just like we would have if we were using it in a script. We'll still have all our includes, that's all fine, but here's the most important part. We're going to get to the part where now we're going to use a bean here. So when setBeans2 hits, what it's actually going to do is call this bean object by saying JSP use bean. Now, if the bean does not exist in the scope that we've stated, which in this case is request, the bean will be created and inserted into that scope. What we're actually going to do is create a bean. We're going to name it woo for web user. So that ID will be very important because that's our parameter name, essentially. We have to notify the system what class we're using for this bean. So that's the com.worldmanager.models.webuser. And the scope we're placing this bean in is request. Essentially, that would be enough to create the object because of the default constructor. However, we want to go ahead and give this parameters based on the stuff we've pulled in from our request. So if our user logs in, we can then use our request.get parameters for the user ID and password and actually use the JSP set property. So we note that the name here is going to be the same for all set properties as the ID of the actual bean. And then the properties we use are our straightforward properties without the get. And again, our capitalized letter has become small. So if you remember when we built this in code, this actually looked like get user ID, and that's exactly what we want. So what you'll see is when we create the bean or use the properties, we actually remove the get and relower back to the property name itself. Essentially the main property name as it would be without the get and the camel casing. And the system will then know that that's the get user ID. It will know that this is the get password with a capital P and this is the get auth level with a capital A as well. And it will set those values on that bean object and place them into the request so that we can pass them from one request into another request. And we're just going to forward on then. We don't have to set anything else because it's already in the request for that ID of woo, and we'll just go on to usebeans.jsp. I'm going to go ahead and save this since I modified it, but I didn't really change anything. So use beans, when we get to that page then, again, since we're going to be using a bean, we must import the code that we're going to be using. And here we simply have to declare the bean object we're going to be using. And this is important. If we don't declare this, you might be tempted to say, well, I don't need that. The bean's already been created. But what happens is this JSP get property on the name Woo will not work on our page because the bean ID needs to be recreated as we hit this page. Even though it exists in the request, it will actually go out to the request and then just set a reference to that. And if it wasn't there, it would create a new one. Either way, this is actually pulling in the object itself. And the value down here underneath this welcome is simply printing out the get property value of that user ID. That would be worthless without an actual object, so that first part is absolutely necessary. So that kind of wraps up our look at the code. Let's go ahead and run it and see what happens when we set our beans here. We'll start again on index, and then we'll go ahead and select the get set use bean. And here it will ask us for a username. So let's once again just say we're Infinite Skills. And our password doesn't really matter. We're not validating anything. So let's go ahead and sign in. And there we go. Welcome, Infinite Skills. So it was able to use on set beans. It was able to pull that information, put all that information into the bean object, and then it actually forward on to use beans, where it was able to pull the information from the property and display that in that welcome tag.